The sun scorched the dry Texas soil as Boaz Winslow stepped down from his old pickup truck, the weight of silence clinging to him like dust. The auction yard buzzed with chatter, cowboy hats shading skeptical eyes. Men leaned on fences, judging the horses one by one, searching for strength, speed, value. But Boaz wasn't watching the stallions. His gaze locked on a frail, patchy colt standing alone in the far corner of the pen, ribs showing, head low, eyes tired like they'd seen too much for something so young. Number 198 was barely holding itself up. Its front leg trembled every few seconds, and its ears twitched slowly, like it was drifting in and out of awareness. But there was something about its stillness. A quiet dignity. Not fear, not even pain, not exactly, but a kind of surrender that made Boaz's chest tighten. It wasn't pity that drew him in. It was recognition. That same look he had seen once before, in Minna's eyes, near the end. He stepped closer to the pen, resting his rough hands on the wood. "That one?" came a voice behind him. Hank Grissom, one of the ranchers, spat into the dirt. "That horse's got nothin' left but bones and breath." Boaz didn't answer. He pulled a pen from his shirt pocket and scrawled a bid on the clipboard. Low. Symbolic. Enough to end the conversation. When the auction runner read it, he chuckled. "You're serious?" Boaz nodded, slow and silent. The others laughed under their breath. "He's gone soft," someone said. "Grief'll do that to a man." Boaz walked away without a word, boots scraping against the dust. He wasn't thinking about logic, or money, or appearances. That colt didn't belong to the land of the living any more than he did these days. But maybe, just maybe, if one of them had a second chance, the other might, too. The drive back to the farm was long and wordless. Boaz kept checking the rearview mirror, watching the colt sway gently in the trailer. When he pulled into the gravel lot, the light was golden, and the breeze carried the scent of dry hay and cedar, familiar but hollow. He guided the colt down slowly, walking it into the small pen out back. Minna used to call that pen the Haven. It hadn't held a soul since she died. Boaz leaned on the fence as the colt settled into the straw. He still hadn't named him out loud, but the word formed anyway, Chance. He wasn't sure if he meant it for the animal or for himself. Maybe both. That night, Boaz sat on the porch in silence, the old rocking chair creaking beneath him. The stars came out, bright and cold. Inside, the house was still. Too still. He took a long sip of coffee, eyes fixed on the barn. For the first time in 2 years, something stirred inside him. Faint, fragile, but real. He didn't know it yet, but bringing that half-dead colt home would unearth more than just old grief. It would open a door to a past he'd buried, and a truth he was never meant to forget. The next morning, the ranch was wrapped in silence. A heavy fog clung to the fields, blurring the edges of fences and barns like a faded memory. Boaz Winslow stood at the kitchen window, cradling a chipped mug of coffee, watching the outline of the small paddock where Chance stood unmoving. The colt hadn't eaten, hadn't made a sound, just stood there, still as stone, staring at the house, as if waiting for something or someone. Boaz pulled on his boots and stepped outside, the porch boards groaning under his weight. The air was cold for late summer. Too cold. He walked slowly toward the pen, the fog parting around him like a veil. As he approached, Chance didn't react. His ears flicked once, but his eyes remained locked on the front door of the house. Boaz leaned on the fence post and exhaled deeply. "You're not just sick," he muttered. "You're haunted. Just like me." The words hung in the air, heavier than the mist. He spent the rest of the morning tending to chores he hadn't touched in months. Mending wire, clearing brush, checking troughs, movements that once gave him peace, now done on autopilot. But something had shifted. Every time he turned, his eyes drifted toward that pen, toward the colt that shouldn't have survived the night, but did. Toward the silent question growing louder in his mind. Why did I bring that animal home? In the afternoon, Boaz walked into the old tack room where Minna had kept everything in order. Her scent still lingered, lavender and leather. He hadn't opened her side of the cabinet since the funeral, but something compelled him. Slowly, he lifted the latch and found a worn metal box tucked behind a saddle blanket. He knew that box. He just didn't expect to feel so much when he touched it. Inside were photos. Faded, curled at the edges. One showed Minna holding a colt, not Chance, but close. So close it made his chest ache. On the back, in her handwriting, Summer of '89, he never stood a chance, but I loved him anyway. Boaz closed his eyes. He remembered the fight. How he told her the colt wasn't worth saving. How she stayed up night after night anyway, trying to prove him wrong. And how, when it died, she didn't cry in front of him. But he'd found her in the barn the next morning, curled beside the empty stall. He never said sorry. That night, as the wind shifted and coyotes howled in the distance, Boaz stood on the porch again, coffee forgotten in his hand. Chance was still standing, head low, but eyes glowing faintly under the moonlight. Boaz squinted. For a split second, a single breath, he saw something else in that pen. A shadow. A figure. A woman in a faded blue dress, one hand resting gently on the colt's back. He blinked. Gone. But the feeling remained. This wasn't just about guilt. Or grief. Something was waking up in that barn. Something that had waited too long to be seen. Chance still wouldn't eat. 3 days had passed, and Boaz tried everything. Sweet feed, carrots, apples from the old tree Minna used to pick from. He even warmed oats in a pan like Minna used to do when a horse was colicky. But the colt just stood there, always watching, never blinking long enough to seem at ease. There was no panic in him, no wild fear. Only a strange stillness, like he was waiting for something Boaz didn't understand. And every time their eyes met, it stirred something deep in Boaz's chest, something heavy, old, and unfinished. Nights had grown uneasy. Around the same time every evening, Boaz started hearing things. Soft creaks from the barn, the sound of wood shifting like footsteps, sometimes a distant thump like a hoof against the stall. Once he heard something that stopped his heart cold. A woman's humming. Gentle, wordless. The tune was broken, but familiar. Minna's song. The same one she used to hum while brushing down the horses at dusk. Boaz froze on the porch, coffee halfway to his lips, staring into the dark. There was nothing out there. Just the wind. But the tune had been real. He was sure of it. In the daylight, he told himself it was just his mind playing tricks. Old memories surfacing. But something about Chance's presence made it harder to explain things away. The colt didn't act sick, not like others Boaz had seen in his years on the land. He was too alert, too aware. And he watched Boaz like no animal ever had, like he could hear the thoughts Boaz wasn't saying. Boaz caught himself talking out loud more than once, telling Chance things he'd never said to another soul. "I should have listened to her more," he mumbled one morning. "I should have fought less. She was always right about the horses." That afternoon, Boaz opened the tack room, a place he hadn't entered since the funeral. The air inside smelled of leather, dust, and time. In the back corner, beneath a moth-eaten blanket, he found a small wooden box with Minna's initials carved into it, M.W. He sat down, heart hammering. Inside were old keepsakes and a bundle of unsent letters, each addressed to him. The top one was dated the week after her diagnosis. Her words trembled with quiet fear and longing. "You don't talk any more, Boaz," she wrote. "Not like you used to. I miss the way you used to see me." He read it twice, then a third time, and something inside him cracked. That night, thunder rolled far off in the hills. Boaz stood in the doorway, eyes locked on the paddock. Chance was lying down now, not in pain, just resting. But when their eyes met again, Boaz felt it, sharp and sudden. The look wasn't just recognition. It was remembrance. That colt didn't feel like a stranger. And Boaz wasn't sure anymore if what he was seeing was real, or if the past was finding a new way to speak. The fourth night came with no stars. The clouds were thick, low, and unmoving. Boaz walked the perimeter of the ranch like he used to back when everything still made sense, back when the sound of crickets and the hum of the barn lights meant life was normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. The porch light flickered even though he'd replaced the bulb the week before. The air smelled of rain, but the sky didn't break. And every time he looked at the pen, Chance was already looking back, as if waiting for him to figure something out. Boaz wasn't a man prone to fantasy. He believed in land, labor, and loss, in that order. But the last few days had begun to unravel something steady in his mind. Chance hadn't eaten more than a handful of hay since arriving, yet his eyes were bright, his stance was stronger. Boaz could see muscle returning where there had only been bone. And still, the colt didn't make a sound. Not a single whinny, not even a grunt of pain. Just that constant, unnerving stare, like the horse knew every word Boaz hadn't said to Minna before she died. That afternoon, Boaz took a shovel out to the far end of the pasture. There was a place out there beneath the cottonwoods, shaded, quiet. It had once been used to bury stillborn calves or animals lost in winter storms. He hadn't been back there since the day he and Minna buried a foal she couldn't save. He remembered the way she cried silently, fingers buried in the earth. He hadn't known what to say. He'd just covered the dirt and walked away. Now, as he stood there again, the silence pressed in like a judgment. He knelt, cleared the overgrown grass, and saw the old wooden marker, weathered, barely standing. The initials were still faintly visible, M.W. Not for Minna. For Morning Wind, the name she gave that little foal before it died. She'd loved that animal more than anything, convinced it was special, different. Boaz had dismissed it. "It's just a horse," he'd said. He was wrong. And maybe now, the past was circling back, not to punish him, but to finish something left undone. When Boaz returned to the barn, Chance was standing, alert. The colt walked toward him for the first time without hesitation. Boaz froze. The colt's eyes glowed amber in the dim light, and in them, Boaz saw something so familiar it stole his breath, Minna's calm, unshakable gaze. He staggered back a step, heart pounding. His throat tightened, and for the first time in years, he whispered her name out loud, "Minna!" A gust of wind tore through the ranch, slamming the barn doors open behind him. Boaz turned, startled. The air had changed, cooler, charged. When he turned back, Chance was still standing there, eyes steady, unmoved. Boaz's knees weakened. He reached out, touched the colt's forehead, and felt something pulse through his hand. Not warmth. Not life. Something deeper. Something timeless. And in that moment, Boaz understood, this wasn't just about grief anymore. The earth had tried to bury something, but it was never meant to stay buried. The wind didn't stop that night. It moved through the ranch like something with a purpose, not loud, but constant, like a whisper that refused to die. Boaz couldn't sleep. He sat in his rocking chair on the porch, staring at the barn as it shifted gently in the darkness. Chance stood in the paddock, unmoving, eyes fixed on the house as if waiting for something to change. At midnight, Boaz gave up pretending to rest. He grabbed the lantern and made his way across the yard. The night air was colder than it should have been. When he opened the barn door, it creaked sharply, louder than usual. Inside, the scent was strange. Not just hay and leather. There was something softer, floral. Lavender. Minna's perfume. He paused, heart beating faster, and turned the light toward the back of the barn. the small storage room Minna had always kept for herself. He hadn't opened that door since the funeral. But now, something pulled him there. The doorknob stuck for a second before giving way. Everything inside was untouched. Her grooming brushes, saddlecloths, notes pinned to the wall. And on the table, half covered by a towel, was a journal. Small, bound in worn leather. Boaz sat on the floor and opened it, the lantern by his side. Her handwriting filled the pages. At first, simple things, chores, weather, reminders. But the further he read, the heavier the words became. One entry stopped him cold. Boaz doesn't talk about morning wind, but I know it hurt him. Maybe more than me. He buried that foal, but never buried the guilt. I think part of him went in the ground, too. He closed the book and stared at the wall in silence. Morning wind. The foal Minna had loved, the one Boaz insisted they let go. He had never apologized, never asked how she felt after. And now, reading her quiet reflections, he realized she had carried more than just her own pain. She had carried his, too. As he stepped back into the main barn, Chance was standing at the stall door. The colt took a slow step forward and pressed his forehead to Boaz's chest. Not with fear, not for affection. It felt like recognition. A kind of silent understanding Boaz hadn't felt in years. Then, as he turned to leave, his lantern flickered. On the wooden wall, just above the feed bins, he noticed faint letters carved into the grain. He leaned in, heart thudding, and read them out loud. Finish what we started. The next morning came slow and gray. Rain had started sometime before dawn, soaking the earth in silence. Boaz stood at the window, coffee cooling in his hand, eyes locked on the paddock. Chance was lying down now, not from weakness, but from calm. The colt's breathing was steady, his body relaxed. It was the first time Boaz had seen him truly at rest. And yet, something inside him churned. The words on the wall still echoed in his head. Finish what we started. He hadn't told anyone. Who would he even tell? The letters had looked old, but he knew they hadn't been there before. He'd cleaned those walls himself last winter. No one else had been in that barn. No one alive, anyway. He walked out into the mist, boots sinking slightly in the wet ground. Chance raised his head as Boaz approached, ears twitching. The rain clung to Boaz's coat as he reached over the stall door, brushing the colt's mane with slow, steady hands. He didn't speak this time. Words felt small. Instead, he listened, to the rain, to the wind, and to whatever it was that had followed him out here from a time long gone. That afternoon, he returned to the pasture by the cottonwoods. The earth was soft now, easier to dig. He brought with him the journal, a spade, and a framed photo of Minna, the one where she stood beside Morning Wind, laughing. He didn't know what he was planning. Maybe a kind of offering. Maybe closure. Or maybe he just wanted the land to remember her the way he did. As he placed the frame at the foot of the old marker, the wind picked up. Not harsh, just enough to lift the leaves. Boaz knelt in the mud, one hand on the soil, the other gripping the photo. I wasn't ready then, he whispered. But I'm ready now. A tear rolled down his cheek, the first he'd allowed in years. When he returned to the barn, something was different. The air was warmer. The lavender scent was gone, replaced by the grounded smell of fresh hay and clean rain. Chance stood tall, eyes brighter than they had ever been. For a moment, Boaz saw it, not with his eyes, but somewhere deeper. The shape of Minna, standing behind the colt, smiling. Boaz blinked. The vision faded. But the feeling stayed. Whatever this was, it wasn't just grief anymore. It was purpose. A second chance not just for the horse, but for the man who once walked away. And this time, Boaz wasn't walking away. The rain cleared by morning, leaving behind a quiet so pure it almost hurt. Fog hovered over the pastures like a memory that hadn't quite settled. Boaz stood near the barn, watching as sunlight spilled gently across the field. Chance trotted, slow but steady, stretching his legs with a grace Boaz hadn't seen before. The colt's body had changed. He was filling out, muscle returning, movement smoother. And his eyes, still deep, still knowing, now carried something else, trust. Boaz hadn't expected this. When he bought the colt, he didn't imagine healing, for either of them. It was supposed to be a gesture. A burden, maybe. Something to feel again. But now, it was more. The bond had grown quietly, like roots under the soil. No commands. No training. Just presence. Boaz had stopped trying to fix Chance. And somehow, that was when the change began. Inside the house, the air felt lighter. He left the doors open, let the wind move freely through the halls. For the first time in 2 years, he pulled the sheet off Minna's piano. It hadn't been touched since her last morning. Dust coated the keys like frost, but the shape of her favorite song still lingered in his mind. He pressed a single note. It echoed too loudly in the quiet room. Then another. Slowly, painfully, he began to play. That night, Boaz sat by the fire with the journal in his lap. He reread the same passage, one he kept returning to. If he ever forgives himself, I think something beautiful could still grow here. Minna's words didn't haunt him. They steadied him. She had seen something in him he'd refused to see. And now, watching Chance recover day by day, Boaz began to believe that maybe it wasn't too late to grow something again. The next morning, he loaded up the old truck. Not to leave, but to begin. He brought Chance out of the paddock, fitted him with a new halter, one Minna had stitched years ago but never used. The leather was stiff, but the fit was perfect. Chance didn't resist. He stepped into the trailer with quiet confidence, as if he understood exactly where they were going. Boaz didn't have a full plan. Just an idea. A feeling. A direction. There were still things buried in this land. Stories left unfinished, people he had pushed away, places where the past still lingered like dust in forgotten corners. But this time, he wasn't running from it. He was riding straight toward it. Boaz drove with the windows down, letting the spring air rush into the cab like a breath he'd been holding for years. The trailer bumped behind him, Chance steady and calm inside. They hadn't gone far, just beyond the hills where the ranch lines blurred into county roads. But to Boaz, it felt like a crossing. A shift between who he had been and who he might still become. He pulled up near an old abandoned property, a place most folks had forgotten. But Boaz hadn't. It was where Minna grew up, and where they spent the first years of their marriage in a small weather-beaten house surrounded by wildflower fields. Time had not been kind to the place. The roof sagged, the windows were gone, and vines crawled up the porch like the house was being swallowed back into the earth. Boaz stepped out, boots crunching on gravel softened by time. He opened the trailer, and Chance walked out with quiet grace, ears flicking at the sounds around him. Boaz didn't need a rope. The colt followed him willingly, as if he already knew the place. They walked toward the side of the property, past what had once been a garden Minna loved. Now it was just weeds and cracked soil. But Boaz saw more, not what was, but what had been. Laughter, warm coffee on the porch, Minna humming while brushing paint onto the railings. At the back of the house, Boaz found it, the tree with the initials still carved into the bark. B+M, inside a crooked heart. They'd carved it the week they lost their first child. He hadn't been back here since. Couldn't. Not after the way he shut down, the way he'd buried everything and left Minna alone in that pain. Chance stood beside him, calm and still. Boaz reached out and touched the bark, fingers tracing the old carving like it could open something. And maybe it did. Because right then, something cracked open inside him. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. But for the first time, he let the weight settle fully on his shoulders. Not to break him, to carry it. He closed his eyes, breathed deep, and in the silence, he swore he felt her hand on his back. Not a ghost. Not a haunting. Just love that had never left. When he opened his eyes, Chance was looking right at him. And Boaz finally understood. He wasn't here to save the horse. The horse had come to save him. The morning was crisp, the kind that carries both promise and memory. Boaz stood outside the barn, hands resting on the gate, watching the light spill across the field. Chance moved with quiet strength now. No more trembling steps, no more glassy eyes. The colt had grown into something more than what Boaz had rescued. He was whole. And in a strange way, so was Boaz. But something tugged at him. A feeling that there was still one thing left to do. He didn't know exactly what, only that it had to be done out there, beyond the ranch, where the land was wild and open. Where Minna had always said dreams were meant to breathe. So he saddled Chance for the first time. The leather creaked, stiff from years without use, but the fit was perfect. Just like she'd made it. Boaz hesitated before climbing into the saddle. It had been years since he last rode. His body had grown stiff, but not his spirit. As he swung his leg over, something settled deep in his chest, not fear, but respect. For the horse. For the journey. For the woman who'd quietly prepared him for this moment, even in death. They rode west, along the edge of the hills, where the grass turned golden and the wind picked up in long, low gusts. The rhythm of Chance's gait was steady, powerful. Boaz didn't guide him much. He didn't have to. The colt seemed to know where they were headed. Past the dry creek, past the broken fence that no one had fixed in years, to the spot where Boaz and Minna used to talk about building a second home. A place for family, for guests, for beginnings. Boaz dismounted and looked out across the valley. It was empty, quiet, but to him it felt full. Full of echoes, of conversations that had once been carried by the wind, of laughter that still lived in the earth. He reached into his coat and pulled out Minna's journal. He placed it on a flat rock, weighing it down with a horseshoe Chance had lost during their first week together. A symbol of struggle, survival, and luck. "This is yours now," he whispered. "Ours." Chance stood nearby, ears alert, tail flicking softly. The sun broke through the clouds, and Boaz felt warmth on his face. Not just from the light, from something deeper. Something final, but not the end. Just the closing of a long, hard chapter. And the opening of another. Spring settled over the land like a quiet blessing. The grass had turned rich and green, the soil finally soft again beneath Boaz's boots. He stood near the paddock, arms crossed, watching as Chance trotted freely across the open field. No halter, no reins, no hesitation. Just movement. Just freedom. The colt had become something more than what he was. Not just stronger, but radiant. Like something fully alive. Boaz smiled, not with joy exactly, but with acceptance. A peace that had taken years to find now lived quietly in his chest. The ranch, once a place of silence and wait, had begun to breathe again. He left the doors open. Let the breeze in. Sometimes he'd hear creaks in the hallway, or catch a whisper in the barn. He didn't chase them any more. Some spirits don't haunt, they stay because they're still needed. The piano had become part of his mornings. Not full songs, just a few notes, enough to wake the day gently. Boaz had even taken to writing in the journal Minna left behind, filling in the blank pages she never touched. Some entries were memories. Others were promises. One, written just days ago, said simply, "You were right. He saved me." One afternoon, a young couple from town drove out to see the ranch. They were looking for a quiet place to board their horse. Boaz showed them around, and when the woman saw Chance, she gasped. "That's him," she whispered. "That's the horse I dreamed about. The one with the golden eyes." Boaz said nothing, just nodded. Some things couldn't be explained. Some things were meant to find their way to those who needed them. As the sun dipped below the ridge, Boaz sat on the porch, boots resting on the worn step, mug of black coffee in hand. Chance grazed near the fence, content, whole. The ranch had changed, but it was still his, and now it carried both memory and meaning. Where once there had been only grief, now there was something else. Not just healing. Hope. Boaz looked to the barn, then to the sky, painted in soft orange and fading blue. He didn't need signs anymore. Didn't need to chase the past. Because somehow, in ways he couldn't fully name, the past had come back not to haunt him, but to heal him. Minna's voice, though long gone, seemed to echo in the breeze one last time. "Thank you for finishing the story."